What if a powerful civilization once existed, not thousands of years ago, but much more recently? What if it was large, advanced, spread across continents, and then almost completely erased from history? There are strange maps, old documents, forgotten references that mention something unusual, a place called Tartaria. On maps from just a few hundred years ago, huge parts of Asia and beyond were labeled with this name, not as a small region, but as something vast, almost like an empire. But today, if you search for it, you won't find a clear answer. No detailed history, no widely accepted explanation, just fragments and questions. So, what was Tartaria? Was it a real civilization that somehow disappeared? Or just a name, misunderstood over time? Some believe Tartaria was not just a place, but a powerful empire with advanced knowledge, technology, and architecture. They point to massive buildings around the world, structures that seem too complex, too precise, to have been built with the tools we are told existed at the time. Grand cathedrals, ornate government buildings, monumental architecture with intricate details, perfect symmetry, and a scale that feels almost impossible. And then comes the question, who built them? Because in some cases, the official explanations feel incomplete. Construction timelines that seem too short, methods that are not fully explained, and a sudden appearance of advanced designs, as if something already existed before the history we are taught. Another part of the mystery comes from old photographs, images from the 1800s showing massive cities with incredible architecture. But something feels strange. The streets look empty, too empty. Large buildings, perfectly constructed, but with very few people around, as if something happened before those photos were taken. Some theories suggest there was a global reset, a moment in history that changed everything, where a previous civilization collapsed or disappeared, and what came after rebuilt on top of it, adopting the structures, renaming them, rewriting their origins. One of the most discussed ideas is something called the mud flood, a theory that suggests entire cities were buried, partially underground, which is why some old buildings appear to have windows and doors below street level, as if the ground itself rose over time, covering parts of structures that were once fully visible. Is this natural or something else? Historians explain these features as normal architectural evolution, changes in street levels, urban development over time. But for some, the pattern feels too consistent, too widespread, too similar across different parts of the world. And then is the biggest question of all. If Tartaria was real, why is it not clearly taught? Why is it missing from mainstream history? Is it because it never existed as a true empire, and the name Tartaria was simply a general label used by mapmakers for unknown lands? Or is there something more, something that was forgotten or intentionally ignored? History is not just a record of the past. It is also a story constructed from available evidence. And sometimes evidence is incomplete, lost, or interpreted in different ways. Over time, names change, boundaries shift, understanding evolves, and what once seemed clear can become uncertain. The idea of Tartaria exists in that uncertainty, between documented history and unexplained mystery. It lives in old maps, in unusual architecture, in questions that do not have simple answers.
But perhaps the most important part is not whether Tartaria was real as an empire, but what the mystery represents. A reminder that history is not always as complete as we think, that there are still gaps, still unknowns, still pieces missing. And sometimes those gaps create stories, stories that grow, spread, and evolve. Because humans are drawn to mystery, to the idea that something important might have been hidden, or forgotten, or waiting to be discovered again. So, was Tartaria real? A lost empire erased from history? Or a misunderstood name that became something bigger over time? The answer is not simple, and maybe that's why the mystery remains.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. And the more you look into it, the more unusual details begin to appear. Details that are small but difficult to ignore, like buildings that seem far too large for the populations that supposedly built them. Massive halls, high ceilings, long corridors, as if they were designed for something more or for a different time. In many cities around the world, there are structures with nearly identical architectural styles, even though they are separated by thousands of kilometers. Similar domes, similar arches, similar patterns, appearing in places that had no direct connection according to history. How is that possible? Was it coincidence, or was there a shared knowledge that spread further than we understand? Some believe these buildings were not created independently, but were part of something larger, a unified style from a forgotten era. And then there are the world fairs, large exhibitions in the 1800s where entire cities were constructed, magnificent buildings with incredible detail. But what feels strange is how quickly they were built, and how quickly many of them disappeared, destroyed, demolished, or simply gone. Why build something so grand only to remove it a short time later? Was it temporary, as officially explained, or was something else happening? Another question begins to form. Why do so many old buildings have features that don't match their supposed purpose? Doors that are unusually tall, windows placed at strange levels, basements that look more like buried floors, as if the ground level is not the original level. And if that is true, then what is beneath what we see today? Layer under layer, how much of the past is still hidden below our feet? There is also something else that adds to the mystery. Old photographs that seem almost too perfect, cities that look newly built, clean, organized, but missing something important. People. In some images, there are very few individuals visible despite the scale of the environment, as if the population was not fully there yet, or something had changed. Of course, there are explanations: long exposure photography, technical limitations, timing of the shots. But for some, it still feels unusual, like a moment captured in between something, before or after a shift. And this is where the mystery of Tartaria becomes something more, not just about maps or architecture, but about perception, about how we understand the past and how easily that understanding can change. Because history is not a fixed image, it is something we build from pieces, documents, artifacts, interpretations, and when some pieces are missing, the picture becomes incomplete, open to questions, open to theories, some grounded in evidence, others built from curiosity. And Tartaria exists right in the middle of that space, not fully proven, not fully explained, but impossible to ignore. Because even if the idea of a global Tartarian empire is not supported by mainstream history, the questions it raises are still powerful. Questions about architecture, about timelines, about how knowledge spreads,
and how much of the past we truly understand, or think we understand. Maybe there was no single lost empire, no hidden global civilization, but instead something more subtle, a combination of forgotten cultures, lost techniques, misinterpreted records, blended together over time into a larger mystery. Or maybe there are still things we have not yet discovered, still buried, still hidden, waiting to be understood. And that is what keeps this mystery alive. Not certainty, but possibility. The possibility that history is more complex than it appears, and that sometimes what we don't know is just as important as what we do know.
And as you keep exploring this idea, something interesting begins to happen. The mystery starts to shift. It is no longer just about Tartaria. It becomes something wider, a question about how we understand everything. Because once you begin to question one part of history, it becomes easier to question other parts. Not to reject them, but to look at them with a different perspective, a more open perspective, one that accepts that not everything is fully known, and that some parts of the past may always remain unclear. There are entire regions of the world where records are incomplete, stories passed down through generations instead of written in detail, events that were never fully documented or were recorded from only one point of view. And over time, those perspectives become the dominant version, while others fade away, not necessarily erased, but simply forgotten. And when something is forgotten long enough, it can begin to feel like it never existed at all, until someone finds a small clue, an old map, an unusual structure, a detail that doesn't quite fit. And that is often how mysteries begin, not with a clear discovery, but with a feeling, a sense that something is missing or does not fully align. And the human mind naturally tries to fill those gaps, sometimes with evidence, sometimes with imagination, and sometimes with a mix of both. This is how ideas grow, how theories form, how mysteries like Tartaria continue to evolve, because every person who looks into it sees something slightly different. Some see patterns, some see coincidences, some see hidden connections, and others see misunderstandings, all looking at the same pieces, but assembling them in different ways. And that raises another quiet question, not about Tartaria, but about perception itself. How much of what we believe is based on what we have seen, and how much is based on how we interpret it? Because two people can look at the same thing and come to completely different conclusions. One sees mystery, another sees explanation. One sees something hidden, another sees something misunderstood, and both feel certain that they are right. So where does the truth exist? Is it in one version, or somewhere in between? This is what makes mysteries like this so powerful. They do not give clear answers. They create space. Space for thought, space for questioning, space for curiosity. And that curiosity is what keeps the story alive. Because even if the idea of Tartaria is not confirmed, even if it remains a collection of theories, it still does something important. It makes people look closer, look deeper, pay attention to details that might otherwise be ignored. And in doing so, it changes the way we see the world, even if only slightly, even if only for a moment. And maybe that is where the real value lies, not in proving the mystery, but in exploring it. Because sometimes the act of questioning is more powerful than the answer itself. And the longer you stay with the idea, the quieter it becomes. Less about big claims and more about small observations, details that don't demand attention but gently invite it. Like the way certain buildings feel older than their official dates, not because of visible damage, but because of their design, their weight, their presence, as if they belong to a different context, a different understanding. There is something about old architecture that creates a strange feeling, a sense of permanence, of something built to last far longer than the people who created it. And when you stand in front of such structures, there is often a quiet question. How was this really done? Not just physically, but conceptually. What kind of thinking leads to something like this? Because building something large is not only about tools, it is about vision, about understanding space, balance, proportion. And when that level of understanding appears in multiple places, across different regions, it begins to feel less random and more connected. Not necessarily through a single empire, but perhaps through shared ideas, shared knowledge, ways of thinking that moved across cultures over time, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways we no longer fully understand. And this brings the mystery into a quieter space, away from the idea of something hidden or erased, and closer to something subtle, something that faded, not suddenly, but gradually, as knowledge changed, as priorities shifted, as new systems replaced old ones. Because history is not only about events, it is also about transitions, moments where one way of thinking becomes another. And in those transitions, some things are carried forward, while others are left behind. Not always intentionally, but simply because they are no longer needed or no longer understood. And when something is no longer understood, it can begin to feel mysterious, even if it was once completely normal. This is how ordinary things become extraordinary over time. A technique becomes a mystery. A method becomes a question. A structure becomes a puzzle. And eventually, a name like Tartaria becomes a symbol, not just of a place, but of the unknown itself. A way of describing that feeling, that sense that something doesn't fully add up, even if we can't explain why. And maybe that is why this idea continues to grow, not because it is proven, but because it resonates. It connects with that part of the mind that looks at the world and quietly asks, is this the full story? Or is there more? Something just out of reach, something not yet understood. And even if the answer is simple, even if everything has an explanation, the feeling of mystery remains. Because curiosity does not disappear, it evolves. It moves from one question to another, always searching, always exploring. And perhaps that is what keeps ideas like this alive. Not certainty, but the desire to understand. And as this thought settles, it becomes quieter, less about searching and more about observing, not trying to prove, not trying to decide, just noticing the world as it is and the questions it holds. Because not every mystery needs to be solved. Some exist simply to remind us that there is more than what we immediately understand, more beneath the surface, more behind the story, more within the details. And sometimes those details are easy to overlook because they're small, subtle, almost invisible. But when you begin to notice them, they start to connect, quietly, without forcing a conclusion,
without demanding an answer, just forming a pattern that suggests there is depth in places we assumed were simple, and complexity in things we thought we understood. And maybe that is the real shift, not discovering something new, but realizing that what we already see may hold more than we first believed. A building is not just a building. A map is not just a map. A name is not just a name. Each one carries context, history, interpretation, layers that build over time. And sometimes those layers make things clearer, but other times they make things more distant, more difficult to trace, more open to different meanings. And that openness is where mystery lives, not in certainty, but in possibility, in the space between what is known and what is still being understood. And as long as that space exists, ideas like Tartaria will continue to exist too. Not fixed, not fully defined, but present, evolving, changing with every new perspective, with every new question. And maybe that is exactly where it belongs, not as something final, but as something ongoing. A quiet reminder that the past is not just something behind us, it is something we are still learning to see.
And in that process of looking, questioning, and noticing, something subtle begins to change. Not in the world around us, but in how we relate to it. Things that once felt simple begin to feel layered. Things that once felt certain begin to feel open. Not uncertain in a negative way, but open in a curious way. Like there is always more just beyond what we currently see. And that feeling does not need to be uncomfortable. It can be quiet, almost calming, because it removes the pressure to have everything explained, to have every question answered, to place everything neatly into one clear version of reality. Instead, it allows space. Space to wonder, space to observe, space to simply sit with the idea that not everything needs to be fully understood. At least, not all at once. And maybe that is something we have slowly moved away from. In a world that values answers, speed, certainty, we often forget that some of the most interesting things take time. Time to explore, time to question, time to unfold. And mysteries like this naturally move at that pace. They don't rush. They don't demand immediate conclusions. They stay quietly in the background, waiting for attention, waiting for someone to look a little closer. And perhaps that is what you are doing now. Not trying to prove something, not trying to decide, but simply exploring, following a thought, allowing it to lead wherever it goes, without needing to control the outcome. And in doing so, you become part of the process, part of the ongoing attempt to understand the past, not as something fixed, but as something alive, something that continues to change as new ideas appear, as new questions are asked, as new perspectives emerge. And in that sense, the mystery is not separate from us. We are part of it, because every question we ask, every detail we notice, every possibility we consider adds something, not necessarily to the answer, but to the exploration. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the purpose was never to arrive at a final conclusion, but to remain curious, to keep looking, to keep questioning, to keep that quiet sense of wonder alive. And as everything becomes quieter, the need for answers begins to fade. Not because the questions disappear, but because they no longer need to be resolved. They can simply exist like distant thoughts, soft, unresolved, but present. And in that space, there is a different kind of understanding, not based on certainty, but on awareness. An awareness that the past is deeper than it appears, that what we know is only part of a much larger picture, and that some parts of that picture may always remain just out of reach. Not hidden, not erased, but simply not fully seen yet. And maybe that is what makes it meaningful. Because if everything were known, if every detail were clear, there would be no mystery, no curiosity, no reason to look deeper. But as long as there are gaps, as long as there are questions, there is movement, there is exploration, there is discovery, not only of the world, but of how we see it. And perhaps that is where this story leads, not to a final answer, not to a single conclusion, but to a quieter place, where the question remains, gently, in the background, unresolved, but alive. And maybe that is enough. And as this moment settles, everything becomes a little more still. The questions remain, but they feel lighter now, less urgent, less demanding, just present, like a quiet echo in the background. There is no need to reach a conclusion, no need to decide what is true or what is not, only the awareness that there is more, more to learn, more to see, more to understand, even if that understanding comes slowly or not at all. Because sometimes the value is not in the answer, but in the search itself, in the act of looking, of noticing, of questioning, and allowing those questions to exist without pressure, without expectation, just as part of a larger picture, a picture that is never fully complete, always changing, always expanding. And within that, there is a kind of calm, a sense that not everything needs to be fully known for it to be meaningful, that mystery itself has a place, a purpose, a quiet presence. And maybe that is where this story rests, not in certainty, but in possibility, not in answers, but in awareness. And as everything becomes still, the question remains, soft, unanswered, but alive. And now there is nothing left to add, no new detail, no new direction, only what is already here, the thought, the question, the quiet sense that something remains just beyond reach, not far, not hidden, just not fully seen yet. And maybe it was never meant to be, because some things are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be experienced, felt, considered, returned to, again and again, each time from a slightly different place with a slightly different perspective. And in that way, they never truly end. They continue, not as answers, but as questions, living quietly in the background, waiting, not for a solution, but for attention. And now, as everything becomes still, as the thoughts slow, as the noise fades, only one thing remains, a simple awareness that there is more and that it is enough. And as you sit with this thought, it grows quieter still. The questions linger, but they feel less pressing, less like puzzles to solve, more like whispers, hints of something beyond, something just out of reach. And in that space, you realize it isn't about having all the answers. It's about the noticing, the awareness, the willingness to explore, to look again, to question gently, to observe carefully. Because the act of curiosity itself is alive. It moves with you, shapes the way you see, shapes the way you think. And even if the answers never come, the journey itself becomes meaningful. The story continues,
Not in a book, not in a map, not in a record, but in your attention, in your willingness to ask, in your imagination. And now, as the thoughts settle, as the scene grows quiet, all that remains is the awareness that mystery is never truly gone. It lives on, waiting, inviting to be explored again. And as the dust of time settles, one question remains. What if the world we know is only the version we've been shown? What other histories, other truths are still waiting just beyond our sight? Look closely, question everything, because the answers may already be around you, hidden in plain sight. And now, it's your turn to decide. What do you truly believe?